Hi guys, this is Eric Lowe from Swordwind Historical Swordsmanship. In today's video, we're going to be breaking down some of the context for doing an abbattimento which was written down for the unaccompanied one-handed sword or side sword with a two-handed sword or longsword. That's what we've been doing in our past series of videos. And we're going to be looking at today at what is our historical warrant for adapting the form in this way. First off, I want to acknowledge that Bolognese swordsmanship does have plenty of material that is explicitly written for the two-handed sword. That's their term for it. They don't use the word spadone, which is what we would normally associate with a large greatsword the size of a man. Greatsword being the modern HEMA term, not the way that word was used historically. In Marozzo, for instance, this whole third book of his treatise, this is what it looks like in the Swenger translation. This is all explicitly devoted to the two-handed sword. The Unaccompanied Bolognese also has a section which is not complete for the two-handed sword. But there is another section, or at least another mention of two-handed swordsmanship in Bolognese texts, which sometimes gets overlooked and I think is important in the context of what we've been doing over our past several videos. I'm going to be reading from Antonio Manciolino's treatise, the Tom Leone translation, which I strongly recommend, which is titled The Complete Renaissance Swordsman. This is from the introduction to Manciolino's work, and this is what he says. As you fence with the two-handed sword in the gioco largo, keep your eye on the part of the opponent's sword from half blade to the tip. However, once you are at the half sword, and remember here that when Bolognese say half sword, they don't mean gripping the blade, but when your swords are crossed, or what German fences would call a bind. Once you are at the half sword, you should look at your opponent's left hand, since it is with it that he may come to grapples. And if you'll remember from our last video, we actually saw an opportunity in this form where we have an opportunity to come to a grapple with the left hand. We've brought in that thrust, it's set aside, and we have the opportunity to grab the opponent's hilt with the left hand and then do some sort of grapple or close range technique. What's really interesting about Manciolino's mention here is that this is the only thing he says in the entire book about two-handed swordsmanship. The rest of the text has no mention of the two-handed sword. And yet, clearly Manciolino, and he's publishing here in 1530, is aware that two-handed swords exist. He's aware that a Bolognese fencer may wish to, may engage in two-handed swordsmanship if you, that a Bolognese fencer may need some advice about where do you look when you are fencing with the two-handed sword. And he thought that advice was different enough than with other kinds of swords to write it down. So the question arises, where is the rest of the two-handed swordsmanship in Manciolino's text? Why did he bother to write this if he wasn't going to give us any techniques for the two-handed sword? And I think the most reasonable answer to that is that he felt like he did. That in Manciolino's view, the two-handed sword is just a sword that doesn't have anything in your offhand. No dagger, no shield, no cloak, no second sword. Remember, Bolognese is thought of by its authors as a system. We're not starting people over from square one every time we put a new weapon or a new weapon combination in the student's hands. And so I think Manciolino here is basically assuming that he did teach you how to use the two-handed sword. And there simply isn't anything different about it compared to any other lessons that you get in Bolognese fencing, other than this bit about where should you look and when. In that same vein, it's really interesting to note that Marozzo includes 3 forms for the two-handed sword, ranging from the gioco largo or long-range fencing to the gioco stretto or close-range fencing, and then to the straights of the half-sword, as the Bolognese put it, where you engage in grapples or other like very hyper close-range techniques. And yet he doesn't claim to have invented any of those forms. And he does make that claim of several of the forms that he presents elsewhere in Book 2, where he talks about various kinds of companion weapons, or in Book 4, where he talks about various kinds of polearms. He'll say, this is a new form which I am presenting to you, and I think it's really good. But when it comes to the two-handed stuff, and these forms are fairly long and rather complex, particularly the second form is really full of nuance. He doesn't claim to have invented them. Marozzo's publishing in 1532, and he tells us in his introduction that he has been writing this book over the course of his life and his career, and is just kind of now, as an older man, getting around to putting it all in order and publishing it. So these forms, which he presumably inherited from his teacher, were not invented at the start of his career in the early 1500s, in the first years of the 1500s, and we don't even know if his teacher invented the forms when he inherited them or devised them in the late 15th century. And what that means is that Marozzo's two-handed sword material appears to come to us from the 1400s, which puts it within the lifespan of the later devotees of Johannes Lichtenauer, and within the later devotees of Fiore's Armazzari, if we can count Filippo Vadi, who writes in the 1480s as part of that tradition, as he certainly appears to be based on his techniques. So what we have here is medieval two-handed swordsmanship, just as all of Bolognese seems to stretch its roots back into the 1400s at least. And that means that although Marozzo illustrates his two-handed sword as presumably it appeared in the 1530s with a very long blade and a very long handle, and if you look at the frontispiece here, you can see this fencer who has a two-handed sword which reaches all the way up from the floor to his chin. And that's certainly much larger than kind of conventional Hema longswords are usually thought of as being. But these are forms which come to us not from the 16th century, when swords are getting very large and even like past the chin up to the eyebrow, or the top of the head, as a montante or a spadone would be, but from an earlier century when longswords were two-handed swords, I should say, were generally smaller. I say generally. I don't want to claim that all late medieval longswords were the short sorts of things that you sometimes hear overzealous Hema practitioners claiming they were. Even in the 1400s, there were quite long swords that had longer handles than the short-handled things you tend to see in modern reproduction sharps. But this material does date back to a time when those smaller two-handed swords, very wearable with blades that are only about a yard long or so, do exist. And so, putting all of this together, what we have is a system with late medieval longsword teachings, late medieval two-handed sword teachings, when longswords were still very much in vogue in the fencing communities. And the assumption of somebody writing just 2 years prior to Marozzo is that you can take all of this stuff and apply it to the two-handed sword. And in fact, as we'll see when we go through Marozzo's dedicated two-handed sword stuff, a lot of his techniques are very recognizable from one-handed sword forms as well. It's not like he's inventing a whole new form of manipulating the sword just because you've got two hands on it and the handle is long. So, while Marozzo's two-handed sword stuff is definitely worth going through, and we will go through it in later videos, and the same is true for the Anonimo's two-handed sword stuff, it is also true that in Bolognese fencing, if you have one unaccompanied sword, even if that one unaccompanied sword is a two-handed sword, and even if that two-handed sword is rather smaller than what Marozzo illustrates in his book, we still have a warrant for applying any Bolognese unaccompanied sword teaching to it, or indeed any Bolognese teaching at all, so long as it doesn't explicitly rely on having something in our offhand. So there we have it. This is why we are applying a what you might think of as a one-handed sword form to a two-handed sword. Why that appears to be in line with historical practice and Bolognese thinking. If you're interested in the cultural context of why somebody would be fencing without armor and a single unaccompanied sword to begin with, take a look at the other video that we presented on the context of this form itself, and we'll be back soon with another video.